Welcome, everybody. This is a continuation of the Best of Both Worlds subtopic Heroes and Icons series for here at Web Yeshiva. Next week we'll be talking about Harry Potter, and probably there'll be more people interested in that one than in this topic for some reason. But this topic, there's something compelling about the Matrix movies, and I don't mean from a cinematic perspective, although certainly at the time, it was, some people made a big deal about these movies cinematically, the special effects. I just quickly review I'm not going to go over the plot. If you don't already know the plot, don't worry about it. We will just be talking about specific points in the movies, and I won't do major spoilers, but you might be more interested in watching the movies after the session compared to before, but maybe not, and that's okay. So just briefly, there were three. First, there was one movie called The Matrix in 1999, and just like with the original Star Wars movie, I suppose some people are saying, "Lahavdil, don't even go there, don't compare them at all." But in terms of, there are some similarities in the sense that people got all excited about the first Star Wars movie, and there wasn't necessarily going to be another one, at least that's what people thought at the time. Little did they realize that was episode 4 of a whole bunch of movies. But, it had a nice happy ending, the end. And The Matrix, the original movie, also would seem to be a happy ending. And then 4 years later, in 2003, the Wachowskis, the people who created the original movie, they put out 2 more movies, The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions, which ended in a very final way. And the other parallel with the original Star Wars trilogy is that, just like The Empire Strikes Back, the second of the original Star Wars movies, probably some people were disappointed that it ended like in the middle of the story. Like there was a plot arc that ended, but the good guys didn't win. What happened here? Oh, don't worry, there'll be another movie. So in the case of The Matrix Reloaded, also it ended in the middle. So the 2 movies, Reloaded and Revolutions, they are really one long continuation of the story. And because of on a bunch of different levels, they were nowhere near as popular as the original movie. Although I'm not really addressing that issue. But they had some very impressive special effects. There was an additional kind of accompanying movie that was, I don't think it was in the theaters at all. I think it was maybe direct to video, called The Animatrix, also 2003. That was a collection of 9 short films, animated films, not just animated, but done in Japanese anime style. So Animatrix, set in the world of the Matrix, and at least one or really 2 of them called The Second Renaissance Part 1 and Part 2. These are 2 of the smaller films within the Animatrix. That's like the backstory, how there came to be the Matrix in the first place, and it actually contradicted some of the content of the original Matrix movie. So if you are watching the Matrix, then you definitely want to see the Animatrix as well. And I see that Mark points out in the chat there's another one in production. Believe it or not, 18 years after the Matrix trilogy was over, there is a 4th movie that's scheduled to be released in December 2021. But nobody knows yet what it's about, how it's going to star a couple of the original characters, even the ones who got killed in the original trilogy. I don't know. But the reason why we're talking about this movie, this trilogy, is that it it raises questions, questions that are interesting, and so many more questions than your standard science fiction movie. So just to put it in the context of this mini-series, we started by talking about the value of fantasy and speculative fiction, which includes quote-unquote fantasy and science fiction. And the last couple of weeks we spoke about superheroes, which are a type of fantasy mostly. The Matrix is in the category of science fiction. And some people have suggested that one thing that science fiction does really well, or at least can do really well, is raise questions, get you to think about issues that a story that is set in our world here and now might not be able to do that, to ask the what if kind of questions. And the movie The Matrix touched on so many of these issues. Not only are there explicit and implicit references to philosophers and philosophies and religions and ideas in religions, like people have made entire lists. I'm not talking about like, well, you know, this reminds me of, no, like the name of that character is, he's named after a philosopher. Who was that philosopher? What did he say? But issues such as, besides the ones we're going to touch on, it also raised issues of free will, fate versus free will. What is faith, and what are the pros and cons of blind faith? Hopefully we'll get to that a little bit. What is control? And there were so many of these questions that were brought up in something that was otherwise a conventional Hollywood movie that people who were interested in philosophy kind of all sat up and said, wow, well, like this is a great jumping off point. Philosophers aren't so much interested in the answers as much as in the questions, but philosophers got involved, meaning that more articles and books about the Matrix were written by philosophers than about anything else in popular culture, to the best of my knowledge. And I'll show you some of the book covers shortly. But actually, before I talk about the philosophy, the question is there actually Judaism in the Matrix? Because there are explicit references to Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism. Judaism, it's not so clear. If you want an explicit reference, yeah, the name of the good guy's ship is Nebuchadnezzar, which is a little weird. It's not explained. Well, it's from the Bible, right? But like, anyway, so it turns out that the people who most saw Jewish connections in this movie are people interested in Kabbalah, which, to be honest, is not me. But I like the line from Rabbi Pinchas Winston here in source number 1. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought they had hired a resident Kabbalist to work behind the scenes, providing mystical input. There's a long article in source number 2 by Rabbi Moise Navon. He's an engineer who used to be called the Rabbi of Mobileye. He worked for Mobileye on independent vehicles until Intel bought Mobileye, and then he took the opportunity to move full-time into learning and teaching Torah. His website, Divrei Navon, has source sheets of his for over 400 shiurim. And he has a few articles on pop culture. This particular one I didn't want to give you as an extra. There is an extra on the website, a supplemental material. It's an article about the Matrix and Zionism. But I didn't want to give you this one because he actually sells this article. So if you want the full article, I'm not going to give it to you. But you could find it through this website called 13 Petals, which is a website in English and mostly in English, Kabbalistic approaches to all sorts of things, and they have an entire page of links about the Matrix and Kabbalah. So if anybody's interested in that, in the Kabbalistic side, like I said, not me, but that's where you would go. You go to this website, 13 Petals, and Rabbi Navon admits that he's not trying to he's not implying that the Wachowskis intended any of the Jewish themes, and we don't really care what they have to say, the whole issue of the authorial intent. But he does believe that it's possible to explain the Matrix from within the ambit of Jewish philosophy. A couple of the ideas that we'll see in this session are also mentioned by Rabbi Navon, but there are a couple of things in particular. Before I want to focus on Mashiach, which he only has a brief thing about. Before we get to Brian said the good guys live in Zion, right, at Zion. So the elaboration of that is in the supplemental material, and I see that Mark added one of the leaders is Haman, which I at the time was like, what, you mean like Haman from Megillat Esther? No, Haman, the 18th century philosopher. So he's one of the references. But it turns out, what I started to say was that the philosophers, people who are interested in pop culture, got more interested in this. One second. More interested in the Matrix than in any other pop culture. Oh, it is okay. Got that right. Just want to show you an example of the books. Where'd it go? There we go. This was from before. Here we go. Okay, there's a series of books called Popular Culture and Philosophy. The Matrix and Philosophy, a book that I'll bring up shortly, was one of the first books. That was from 2002. But it started in 2000. Okay, I'm just scrolling slowly through this list. Something and Philosophy, Poker and Philosophy, The Beatles and Philosophy, Transformers and Philosophy. We're only up to number 50, and in fact, there are 133 books in this series. Each book in this series is a collection of about a dozen essays, mostly written by professors of philosophy who are interested in the Discworld, Hamilton, 1984, Stranger Things, Rick and Morty, and they think about the issue from a philosophical perspective. And it turns out that there is a competing, so that's from the publishing house called Open Court. There's a competing series from the publishing company called Blackwell. They started a little bit later. They only have 58 books, but there's a lot. There's a lot of them. And Lego and Philosophy, True Blood and Philosophy, X-Men and Philosophy. Anyway, some pretty, if you're interested in a particular pop culture thing, series, game, whatever, and if you're also interested in thinking and philosophy, then this is really the kind of series that it's worth knowing about. What I'm going to share with you now is the book covers of the books that I read in preparation for this class. I didn't read them now. I actually read them, most of them in 2004, not long after the Matrix trilogy was over, when philosophers were cranking out these books. My wife and I were working in the Hillel in Princeton University through the Jewish Learning Initiative on campus, and because we were connected with the Hillel, and the Hillel is an affiliate of the university there, so we had access to the library there, and through the Princeton University Library, we were allowed to ask for books from any library in the United States. And I did, and I was interested in researching this topic, and I ended up getting almost all the books that were available at the time on this topic. So this first one, The Philosopher at the End of the Universe, the ones that I'm starting with now are books by one person. So the table of contents is, if you turn your head to the side, you see Star Wars, Aliens, Total Recall, The Matrix. He has a chapter on each of these. The next books all the rest of the books that I'm going to describe now are actually books written exclusively about the Matrix. This one, which I'm actually holding up right now, Exegesis of the Matrix. Exegesis, of course, is the fancy word for parshanut, explaining it. This one I had to order special. All the others I got from the library, and then I didn't need to own them. This I had to order because there weren't any libraries in America that had it. Written and self-published by a guy in England. It's pretty good, but it's very dense. To be honest, I never actually finished it. But one of these days, since I do own it, I hope to finish it. Just gonna briefly show you the other book covers. The Matrix by Joshua Clover is published by the British Film Institute, and that's like a general analysis of the movie. Like a Splinter in Your Mind. Right. Thank you, Brian. As opposed to the restaurant at the end of the universe. I assume it's a play on that. Like a Splinter in the Mind, which is based on a quote from the Matrix movie. This is written by Matt Lawrence. The next two books are actually Christian books by ministers talking about the Matrix and tying it into Christianity. So this one's called Beyond the Matrix, Revolutions and Revelations, and that's arranged in the shape of a cross. And the next one's called The Gospel Reloaded, by Chris C.A. and Greg Garrett. These are two ministers in Texas. One of them also wrote the books The Gospel According to Tony Soprano and The Gospel According to Lost. And the other one wrote The Gospel According to Hollywood and Holy Superheroes. Anyway, so just so you should know that these issues, these are not philosophy as much as spirituality and faith issues. And now we're moving on to books that are collections. Each one is a dozen essays, each written by a different person. Matrix Revelations, a thinking fan's guide to the Matrix trilogy. That one I also had to buy because it was published in England and they didn't have any copies in the libraries that Princeton had access to. Wait, there's more. Philosophers Explore the Matrix. This was a collection that was originally on the website called whatisthematrix.warnerbrothers.com, meaning Warner Brothers, the producers of the Matrix trilogy, they themselves asked philosophers to write on this topic. So this is, I read these essays before, it was actually in book form. The Matrix and Philosophy, this is from the series that I showed you before from Open Court Publishing. The sequel, More Matrix and Philosophy, also in that same series. Taking the Red Pill, Science, Philosophy, and Religion in the Matrix, almost finished. Jacking into the Matrix franchise, Cultural Reception and Interpretation. And finally, Exploring the Matrix, Visions of the Cyber Present. Yes, I admit it, I read all of these books. But no reading is too much to do to prepare for a class. The other thing that I did when we were at Princeton as part of preparation was they were able to get anything that belonged to any library. So I ordered the Ultimate Matrix Collection, 10 DVDs. They later reissued it on 7 Blu-ray discs. This, I have to say, I didn't want to buy it, and I didn't buy it. But this turned out to be very useful because it has two things in it, which, aside from the movies and all sorts of explanations of the special effects, it had two things in it that at the time you could not get anywhere else. Now you can find both of these things on the internet. One of them is a documentary. If anybody's interested in philosophy and the Matrix after we're done with the session, then I would recommend that you watch this documentary. It's called Return to Source, Philosophy and the Matrix. You could find it on, just Google that title, and you can find it on Vimeo. And the other one that I found very useful is a philosopher commentary on the trilogy by two philosophers, Cornel West, who is a well-known and notorious professor at Princeton University, notorious not for the classes as much as for his political activism, that he did together with Ken Wilber, a philosopher who specializes in consciousness. The two of them did a commentary, an official, like commissioned by the Wachowskis, commentary on all three movies. Meaning, if you want to get how they understand the three movies, and apparently it's not official, but they had a lot of discussions with the Wachowskis, so they're probably on the same page with them, and how the three movies can be seen as one long story with certain themes that, to be honest, none of the essays in any of the books actually present some of these interpretations. So you just search YouTube for philosopher commentary Matrix, and three of the results will be over an hour long, and those are the commentaries by Cornel West and Ken Wilber. Having said that, just before we go back to the source sheet, this is the Holistic Haggadah is a different kind of book. We'll get to it a bit later. How will you be different this Passover night? Okay, let's go back to the source sheet. The Matrix asks two big questions. One of them is, what is real? And the other is, how do you know? How do you know what's real, or how do you know anything? These questions are called by the fields of philosophy that address these issues are called metaphysics and what is real, and how do you know? How do you know anything? So I wanted to point out that the question of which the Matrix raises, what if this world, the world that you're living in right now, what if this is not actually the real world? What if this is actually a computer simulation? What would that be like? And P.S., how would you know? How would you be able to know? So it turns out that the one who first asked this question or thought about this, what if life is not real, but we're living in some sort of simulation that's not the real world? It was actually asked first by Plato. Yes, the original Plato in the Republic, who the famous allegory of the cave. What if there were people who they lived their entire lives sitting in a cave watching shadows on the wall and thinking that that's the real world? Descartes, who is better known for I think, therefore I am, he is known in philosophical circles for many things, one of which is, what if there were a demon? What if there were some malicious power that were manipulating me to think that this is the real world, but it isn't the real world? Moving into, so this is an issue that philosophers, and there's this, I didn't put on the source sheet, but there's this 20th century philosopher, Robert Nozick, who came up with the idea, what if you were a brain in a vat? And you only think that you're experiencing things because that's what your brain is telling you, but in fact, you are only a brain in a vat. How would you know? And would it make a difference? But moving into science fiction to some extent is a good place to ask these questions because you can present all sorts of scenarios that make it less threatening to address these issues in. So, for example, Star Trek, especially the Next Generation and the later ones with the holodeck, which you can put yourself in a simulation where it looks and feels real, but it's actually created by the computer. In the 1990s, especially on Source 4, there were a whole bunch of movies that brought up this issue in some context or other. See, some of the names are mentioned here. Source number 4, book by Chuck Klosterman, a culture critic. Funny title of the book: Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. He had a bunch of insights in this book, and he mentioned a bunch of these movies, and there's a few more that are mentioned here in source number 5. I'm just going to summarize because I want to get to the Matrix. Just to mention a couple of these, in the Truman Show, it's what if your life were a TV show and everybody else in your life were actually a paid actor, everybody except for you. Vanilla Sky, starring Tom Cruise. What if your life were a lucid dream or waking life? What if you're still dreaming? What if you never woke up this morning? What if this is all a dream? How would you be able to know? And not everything in the movie Waking Life, but a lot of it addresses that issue. Existence. What if your life were a video game? Meaning, what if you this is actually a simulation that you entered into on your own and you've already forgotten, but you are still in the video game. Or the 13th floor. What if your life were actually a simulation inside a computer? This is a movie that came out the same year as The Matrix. It's based on a much, much earlier novel. I'm holding it up to the camera. Simulacrum 3, a paperback by Daniel Geulah. The movie was much better than the book. But the point is that The Matrix didn't come up with that idea. It just took that idea, what if you were in a simulation, and combined it with an action movie. Just one more before we go back to The Matrix. The one author who most asked this question, and The Matrix really feels like something that he wrote, but he couldn't have written it because he died in 1982, was Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick wrote 44 novels, 121 short stories, 14 short story collections, and over again in his writing, he brings up these questions. At least 9 movies have been adapted from Philip K. Dick, including Blade Runner. If there were androids, how would you be able to know who's an android and who's a human? And P.S. in the director's cut, what if you yourself were an android programmed to think that you're a human? How would you be able to tell? Other movies made from Philip K. Dick books, Total Recall, Minority Report, A Scanner Darkly, and The Adjustment Bureau. Oh, yeah. And then the TV series, very successful, four seasons with 40 episodes, The Man in the High Castle. What if, Chas v'Shalom, what if the Axis had won World War II? What would the world look like now? Anyway, so Philip K. Dick, if he had still been alive, he certainly would have needed to get a writing credit on The Matrix. The questions for us are like, and therefore what? One of the issues. So, like I said, metaphysics and epistemology. What is real, and how do you know what's real? Some of the philosophers, a lot of them just focus on the movie. Some of them take the movie as a jumping off point to ask, wait a minute. Okay, The Matrix is fiction. Fine. Within the movie The Matrix, the characters are living in a matrix, in a computer simulation. But how about us? Is it possible that we are actually living in a kind of a simulation? Now, this question sounds weird, but it was really addressed not only by Descartes, we mentioned earlier, but it was addressed by Bishop Berkeley, a Christian philosopher who suggested that maybe reality is just inside the mind of God. Very controversial within philosophical circles, but among those philosophers who are addressing this issue in response to the Matrix, there is a debate. And there's some who think that, yes, it's possible that we could be in a simulation. And there are others who say, no, that's ridiculous. Why is that ridiculous? And this is going to bring me to a point from an overlap with Judaism. Source number 7, Dr. David Nixon, professor of philosophy at the University of Washington. When he addresses this issue, the matrix possibility, he says, in the real world, when we're not playing philosopher, we almost never require that a belief be such that it's impossible to be false before we call it known. For example, someone asks me, do you know what time it is? Yes, I do. It's 12:30. Yeah, I recognize the possibility that my watch is off, but that doesn't keep me from saying that I know what time it is. Meaning, even philosophers out when they're not in class, there's such a thing as knowledge for all intents and purposes. So if somebody says, hey, isn't it possible that you're wrong, you think you're living in the real world, this is not the real world, we're just in a simulation, the proper response is, so what? It's not possibility that matters, it's probability. So until you give me a good reason to think that my belief that I live in the real world is not just possibly false, but probably false, I'm not changing anything about what I believe. And this issue was built on by an Orthodox rabbi who writes a column on philosophy and faith in the Parsha publication Shabbaton. I'm holding up what it looks like. It's the blue one. Those living in Israel, a lot of religious Zionist synagogues that get this. His name is is Moshe Roth, Rabbi Dr. Moshe Roth. I don't agree with everything that he writes, but he has a lot of interesting things to say, and he actually published a book just a year or two ago called Fantazi Yahadut, combination of Yahadut, Judaism, and Fantasia, meaning fantasy, and talking about some of the overlaps. I haven't read it yet, but I probably will eventually. He has a column that he published in 2019 called Im Yesh Safek, Ein Safek. If there is a doubt, there's no doubt. And he says, I'm not going to read through the whole Hebrew, I'm just going to summarize. He says, skepticism. There's a lot of skepticism today in all sorts of contexts. And he says, I'll just give you a few examples. He says, you know that there are a lot of people who are skeptical about vaccines. Ooh, yes, we've all heard about them, and not just this year. The anti-vaxxers, that they think that that's actually a conspiracy of the medical scientific establishment. And in the face of all the evidence, they deny that vaccines are actually good for you. He says there are people who, even today, are hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years after of astronomers and physicists dealing with demonstrating that the world is round, I mean spherical, of course. There are people today are convinced that the world is not round, it's flat. There's so many things that we take for granted that somebody out there is skeptical about. So he says, and what do we get from this? He says, here's what I get from it. Ein davar shelo nitan lahatil bo safek. There is nothing that is immune to skepticism. There's nothing that cannot be doubted. Nothing. Everything, even the things that seem the most obvious to the most number of people, there's nothing that cannot be doubted. And why is this important, he says? Because this teaches us Orthodox Jews who are often put on the defense, defend the ideas of traditional Judaism. He says, Lo tzarich litragesh misfeikot. You know what? We don't have to get all worked up about people's doubt. And people who cast doubt on the existence of God and the historicity of Yetziat Mitzrayim and is the Torah from heaven. And he says, aside from the specific ways of answering these questions, he says, you don't have to feel threatened by the fact that somebody doubts what is clear to you, because nothing is beyond doubt. You don't have to, so he actually feels more confident about his beliefs in God, Judaism, etc., more confident from the existence of skeptics about even things like, are we living in a simulation or not? I thought that was an interesting, he doesn't mention the Matrix, but I thought that was an interesting way of connecting the issues, the questions raised by the Matrix, connecting that with the issue of defending Judaism. One more point, which is before we talk about Mashiach, one point which is this is pshat in the Matrix. This comes up in a number of occasions. It's definitely a theme in the Matrix, especially the first movie. The theme of waking up. And it ties from source number 10, the Gospel Reloaded. It's instructive to notice how many times in the film Neo, the main character, played by Keanu Reeves, how many times he wakes up from sleep, from unconsciousness, finally at the end he's resurrected from death. As opposed to Cypher, he is the mild spoiler alert. He's on the side of the good guys, or so they think, until he turns traitor and sells them out to the bad guys. He's the only character in the movie associated with alcohol. And he insists that he sells out to the bad guys because he doesn't like living in the boring real world of the future. He wants to be put in the Matrix and be numb. He wants the pleasure. He wants to numb himself. He's not interested in reality. So the contrast between that he wants to, so to speak, go to sleep, and that wake up, Neo waking up, appears over and over in the movie. Oh, and the song at the very end of the movie, when Neo's in the phone booth, is a song from Rage Against the Machine called "Wake Up." So this is basic shot of the Matrix. What does it have to do with Judaism? Well, as a few people pointed out, I think Rabbi Navon mentions this. The Zohar in Parshat Lech Lecha says, woe to those people, deny me, shenta b'chorehon, who are asleep, who are fast asleep in their little holes, wherever they are. Lo yade, they don't know anything. V'lo mistaklan, they can't see. Eich yakumun bedina, they don't see that they are going to be judged by God. The choshvana eats pakad, that they will be judged, but they're totally asleep to that. Meaning they look like they're leading ordinary lives, but they're not thinking about God. They're not thinking about God judging us. The Zohar says these people are asleep. And along these lines, the way it's formulated very powerfully in the Matrix movie, famous line here in source number 12. It's part of Rabbi Mati Berger from Aisha Torah, gave a series of seminars and then wrote it up in articles called Beyond the Matrix, that Morpheus, who's the main leader of the good guys who recruits Neo, who is the one, the messianic figure, he's explaining to Neo, who's just been woken up from the simulation, the Matrix is everywhere. It's all around us. Even now in this very room, you could see it when you look at your window or when you turn on your television. You could feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It's the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. And this is a very powerful idea that is here, source number 11, Professor of Philosophy William Irwin, and here in source number 12, Rabbi Mati Berger. They both take this idea and say that this is Musar. This is something that we need to take to heart. In what way do we as a society, in what way do I as an individual numb myself or ourselves to the real issues that are there? In what way am I in denial? As Rabbi Berger puts it, the majority of humans are products of society, and you need to wake up and become intellectually independent of the society that's formed your beliefs. Otherwise, you're just a puppet of society. This is a very powerful message. You don't have to be religious to say this, but it certainly fits. I once wrote Dvar Torah. Part of it is here in source number 13, Dvar Torah called Like I Care, Musar and the Matrix, in which I presented a few of these ideas, and I point out that Wachowskis actually mentioned this very explicitly. In an interview, they said it's very easy to live an unexamined life. And even the Rambam, when he talks about the message of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is, wake up, sleepers, from your sleep. Examine your actions and do tshuva. In other words, for us, for traditional Jews, waking up, the metaphor of waking up is doing tshuva. Okay. Having said that, I'd like to focus in our remaining 20 minutes or so. I'd like to focus on the idea of Mashiach. The traditional Jewish belief for the Rambam, it's one of the 13 essential beliefs that there will be a human being who in the future will redeem us Jews, and as part of Geulah, as part of the redemption. And I showed you the cover before of the book, The Holistic Haggadah. Dr. Michael Kagan, who wrote this, he is a scientist, entrepreneur, and filmmaker who lives in Jerusalem and teaches Torah from the perspective of Jewish renewal, also known as a Jewish New Age. And he, in his comment on Shir HaMa'alot, in the Haggadah, we have this Birkat HaMazon. So before Birkat HaMazon, on Shabbat and Yom Tov, there's Shir HaMa'alot. Shir HaMa'alot, B'shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion, Hayinu Kechomim. When God will return us to Zion, it will be like a dream, or we will have been like dreamers. There are two ways to understand this. Either when Geulah happens, it will seem like a dream, which fits in with a line from the Matrix, the third movie, when the good guys win, and Morpheus says, I've imagined this moment for so long. Is this real? Like pinch me, am I dreaming? That's one of the interpretations. It's probably the more standard interpretation of this pasuk. It will be like we're dreaming, like dreamers, like the name of that book about the 6-Day War. Or a different way to interpret the pasuk is the return, the Geulah, means I am now truly awake when Geulah happens, and I have left the dream world of temporary illusions. Meaning, Hayinu kecholmim, when God redeems us, we will feel like we've just woken up, and all of life in the past, galut, the exile, the diaspora, it will feel like it was a dream that we have just woken up for. In which case, then, Zion represents the full God consciousness, not only technically returning to the land and getting a Beit HaMikdash and whatever the ideal state of in Messianic times, but an advancement in human consciousness, God consciousness. So Dr. Kagan says, just in one sentence, this is the theme of the film, The Matrix. Maybe the first movie. That is one way to understand it, meaning, repeating what we just said before about the theme of waking up, which is definitely a major theme of The Matrix, especially in the first movie, and the messianic, that the issue that keeps coming up in the movie is Neo the one? Is he basically the Messiah who has been prophesied? Is he going to save everybody? Tying these two together, it's that when there is Geulah, then looking back, we'll feel like we just woke up. It was like we just woke up out of the Matrix. That, you could argue, is pshat in the Matrix. I don't know if it's pshat in the pasuk in Tehillim, but that is certainly one way to connect them. A different approach, and this is actually source number 15, is I think the most interesting or thought-provoking Jewish perspective on the Matrix and Mashiach. It's written by a guy. I couldn't find anything about him other than this was part of his master's thesis at Harvard Theological Seminary. He's writing from a Christian perspective, not a Jewish one. But Paul Fontana asks, so where is God? There's no character in the movie that seems to correspond to God. And he suggests that God in the movie is played by God. That is, the God figure in the Matrix is somewhat akin to what he calls the Judeo-Christian notion, we'll just call it the Jewish notion, of an intangible God who, although transcendent, is active in the affairs of human history and the economy of salvation, but a lot of the time we don't see God's presence explicitly. In fact, as we mentioned in a previous session, there's Hester Panim. God hides his face. So a lot of the time, it's not obvious that God is there. Part of our emunah, part of our faith in God is that God is there even when we can't see him. So Paul Fontana says, this film, The Matrix, contains precisely as many references to God as Shir HaShirim does. None. Or I could say as Megillat Esther, probably a better example. So the key to finding God in The Matrix is not to look for God directly, but rather to observe God's presence in the general flow of the film. That is, he suggests that the people in the Matrix they're living in 2199, that's the real world. The Matrix, the simulation, pretends that it's 1999, but in fact, the real world is 200 years later. And Fontana suggests the feeling, God is not with us. Why has God forsaken us? This is surely felt by the people in the year 2199. And in which case, so it's understandable that they think that if there ever were such a God abandoned us. God allowed humanity to be conquered by the machines. That's the backstory of the Matrix movie. And yet, God breaks into the action of the film meaning the first Matrix movie, 3 times, where 2 of them, it says explicitly that it is a miracle. So let me just share with you. Just a minute. Yeah, there it is. Share. Whoops, sorry, that's not that one. There. Okay. Can you see the list of books that I put on the screen before? Okay. Not that one, this one. So there's a famous scene in which they say we need is guns, lots of guns, before they go charging into, the good guys go charging into the lair of the bad guys. But there's a line before it that's often missed. Let's watch that line right now.
Okay, so what do you need? Besides a miracle.
You hear that? He uttered it under his breath. So what do you need besides a miracle? And Neo responds,
guns. Lots of guns.
So since this is a simulation, so he can actually produce guns, and this is part of the special effects of the movie. So the famous line here is, what do you need besides? The famous line is guns, lots of guns, and yes, there's a lot of shooting violence in this movie. But the line right before it is, what do you need besides a miracle? Meaning the fact that the good guys win, that is actually a miracle. And then there is a scene in which, here we go, the bad guys, it looks like the good guys are about to win. The bad guys manage to, this is one of the bad guys right here, Agent Smith, played by Hugo Weaving. The bad guys managed to shoot and kill Neo, the good guy. And you're like, what do you mean? They just killed him. So within the Matrix, and then his girlfriend, Trinity, a little Christian reference there, finds him in the real world, and she tells him that you can't die. It was prophesied that you would save us, etc. And she kisses him, and then his heart starts beating again. In other words, he is like, this is Tchiat HaMetim. Okay, and she says, now get up. Just watch a little bit more. He is back in the Matrix, having been shot to death, and he stands up. And he makes the boat stop in midair, because he has finally understood what makes the Matrix tick. He is the one. He sees the light, that the bad guys are actually made of light. They're not real. He sees through the Matrix, and that allows him to control it. That allows him to stop bullets and later to dodge them. Very powerful image there. So Paul Fontana suggests that is the third miracle. The second one, two of them are explicitly mentioned miracles. Oh, the bad guy says, it would take a miracle to stop me. And then he gets stopped. We didn't watch that. We didn't have time for that. Also, it's very violent. And then what do you need besides a miracle? And then the good guy is literally resurrected from the dead, which is, talk about a miracle. That's another one of our essential beliefs, according to the Rambam, the resurrection of the dead in the future. So Paul Fontana suggests all three of these events are true miracles, unexplainable without God's renewed favor. In other words, this is God in the Matrix, that the people have felt abandoned and beaten and have been this way for hundreds of years, and God sends the one, the messianic figure, who, as prophesied, is able to overcome all of the problems and save everybody. So you could argue that in that sense, the Matrix corresponds to the belief in Geulah in Jewish tradition. Paul Fontana also adds, and this is actually significant considering he's writing as a Christian to Christians, that no one in ancient Israel expected a suffering spiritual king, which is what the Gospels present Jesus as being. In many ways, Neo in the Matrix is closer to the military Messiah that Israel expected. In other words, one of the things that our tradition says that Mashiach is going to do is fight the wars of God. and fight the Rambam says Milchamot Hashem, the wars of God. So as far as that goes, this Christian Paul Fontana admits that aspect of Neo, the messianic aspect of Neo in the movie, is more like a Jewish Mashiach than a Christian idea of Mashiach. But having said that, almost all of this is about the first movie. And if you want a clear story, good triumphs over evil, watch The Matrix, but then stop there. Because part of one of the multiple reasons to dislike movies 2 and 3 is that they're confusing. The story is a lot more complicated, and even things like, is Neo the one? It's not so clear. And with this, I want to point out that sources, one second, I just switched to, source number 17, Rabbi Berger from Eshet Torah, points out that even in the first movie, and for sure in movies 2 and 3, there's this constant theme of, is Neo the one, and can he actually do it? Can he actually save everyone? And Rabbi Berger asks, does Mashiach know that he is the one? Well, let's look at Moshe. Did Moshe grow up knowing that he would redeem Jewish people? Well, for sure not. God, when Moshe is 70, God shows up in the burning bush and says, you are the one. And what did Moshe say? No, I'm not. Send anyone except for me. And so Rabbi Berger suggests that Mashiach, who is, we expect to take us to create the redemption in the future, in some ways Mashiach will be parallel to Moshe, who was destined to take the Jews out of Egypt, but he didn't want to, and he might very well have not been convinced that it was him. He's not born the one. He has to become the one. And this is an interesting, more subtle parallel between Mashiach ideas in the Matrix and Mashiach ideas in our tradition. There's this also in the first movie. Neo meets with the Oracle, who is someone who seems to know everything that's about to happen, even to the point where she says, "Don't worry about the vase," and Neo turns around and knocks over the vase, because she knew that he was about to knock it over. But she then tells him that she's not convinced that he's the one, because he's not convinced that he's the one. And Morpheus then afterwards, so Neo's shocked, like, what do you mean? Casting doubt on the whole premise that he's going to save everybody. So Morpheus says to him, sooner or later you're going to realize that there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. And Neo has to go through a whole bunch of things in the first movie, and then in different ways, a whole bunch of other things in the second and third movies before he actually redeems everyone. And this leads us to one more point, which is, I didn't see anybody connect this on the Jewish level to the Matrix, but it seems to me that it works really well, and that is, in the second and third movies, things get complicated, and for this I recommend reading some discussions of what's really going on in the second and third movies. There's a whole back and forth where Neo says to Morpheus, it was a lie. The one was never meant to end anything. It was all another system of control. So this is in the second and third movies. They shift from, is he the one, to what do you do about it? What do you do about the fact that it could be he's not the one? So Morpheus, who's the one who believed in Neo all along, he continues to believe. He doesn't lose his faith. He merely reinterprets it. He recognizes that he didn't understand the real meaning of the prophecy. And he doesn't know what it actually means, but he acts with that groping confidence characteristic of faith. This is in source number 18. Dr. William Jaworski, who's professor of philosophy at Fordham, and he goes on to say Morpheus' faith is challenged and reinterpreted, but not lost. And in the end, the prophecy is fulfilled, the end of the third movie. Don't worry, if you didn't see this, I am not really giving away anything. Neo returns to the source and ends the war. The way this happens is not the way that Morpheus or the Oracle or anybody else anticipated. Meaning he fulfills the prophecy, but doing it in a way that nobody in the entire movie, including the people who seemed to know everything that was going to happen, nobody foresaw that. Sometimes that's the way the prophecies happen. As literally the very last lines of the Matrix Revolutions, did you always know? The Oracle is asked. And she says, oh, no, I didn't, but I believed. That's the end of the movie, meaning the faith that there will be Geulah, that can help you deal with things not working out the way that you expected. So, for example, you know that there are still a lot of people today who are not convinced that we're in Untitled Geulah, the beginning of the redemption process. You know why? Without bringing up political, religious issues, because this is not the way we expected it to happen. We thought that they were going to hear a shofar being blown and one big eagle or many eagles will show up and we'll get on wings. God will fly us to Jerusalem, and then Mashiach will miraculously win everything, and then we'll all be transported miraculously. That's what most of our ancestors imagined. And there are opinions in the Gemara that sound like it, that the Geulah will be super miraculous. So what happens when you got Herzl and you got Ben Gurion and a bunch of different stages, and you have non-religious people who are in charge of the state? How could this be connected with Geulah? It's not the way that I was expecting it to happen. So the only question is, how convinced are you that God has to do things the way that you thought God was going to do things? How flexible are you to the possibility that maybe the Geulah will happen differently from the way that people expected it? And there are a lot of sources in the Gemara about Geulah and Mashiach, and they all contradict each other. But one line, one of the weirder ones in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, source number 20, Rabbi Zera, when he would find rabbis who were trying to figure out when Geulah was going to happen, do gematrias and read Sefer Daniel and what year are we in now, he would say to them, please, I beg of you, don't push off Geulah. By calculating it, you are pushing it off. Because it was taught there are three things that will happen, Holistic Haggadah, meaning when nobody is paying attention. Three things happen. Mashiach, finding a lost item, and getting bitten by a scorpion. It's a funny combination. Those three things never happen when you're expecting them. Nobody expects a scorpion, in Monty Python. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. You never find your lost thing. You never find it where you looked for it. And you know what? Guess what? Mashiach is going to be like that too, says Rabbi Zera. Mashiach is not going to happen when we're paying attention. Mashiach is going to show up somewhere else, somehow else. So just let go of your calculations. Hashem does not have to bring Geulah the way that you thought it was going to happen. The Rambam takes this Gemara and, one of the Gemaras on the same daf, Sanhedrin daf Tzadi Zion, and he says very powerfully, he describes what he thinks is going to happen when Mashiach comes, namely no miracles, but still building the Beit HaMikdash, fighting the wars of God. And he says, listen, very, very uncharacteristic of the Rambam. The Rambam thinks you can know God, you can know Jewish belief, it's all open, it's all clear. The Rambam hardly ever says we can't know something, but he says that here. He says nobody can know what's actually going to happen with Geulah until it actually happens. It's not clear in the prophets, and even the rabbis did not have a Kabbalah, did not have a clear tradition as to what will happen. They just interpreted Psukim in different ways, and that's why they have arguments. So the Rambam says for at least the order of what will happen when, this is not an Ikar Badat. That's not important. What's important, rather, is to believe that Mashiach will come. Don't worry about the details, because the details might very well not happen the way that you expect them to. He says, don't spend time on these discussions. which explains why, except for a daf or two in Sanhedrin. They're like, there's no Masechet about Mashiach. There are very, very few books in Jewish tradition about Mashiach. The Rambam says it's not worth spending time on because this sort of thing, it will not bring you any closer to fearing God or loving God. So you know what? Just what? And so don't calculate the end, but rather just wait. That's it. Yichakeh, just wait, and you should believe in general that Mashiach will come, and don't worry about the details. Because if you get caught up in the details, the Rambam just says it won't bring you closer to God in any way, so it's a waste of time. Other people have suggested that it will actually push you away because everybody who calculates the time of Mashiach, they end up calculating it in their time. You know, not surprisingly, the Rambam and the Ramban in the 1200s thought the Mashiach was going to come in the 1200s. And people who say, oh, I heard from a Kabbalist that Mashiach is coming, they're not going to say in 100 years. They're going to say this year. Everybody always thinks it's going to be this year. So, well, you know, you want to tie in gematrias together, fine. You know, that would be nice. The end, you know, nice interpretation. But if you really get caught up in it, if you think this great rabbi said Mashiach is coming this year, he will come this year, well, then what's going to happen if Mashiach doesn't come this year? The same exact thing that happened every time in Jewish history, literally every time in Jewish history that anybody ever predicted Mashiach, 100% of the time Mashiach did not come then. At least some of those times, people got very depressed. The Jewish communities were weakened, that created cracks and doubts in their emunah, because after all, we knew that Mashiach was coming. So that's another reason, besides what the Rambam says, to say, you know what? Mashiach, we believe that Mashiach will come. Don't convince yourself of any of the details, because if you convince yourself of any of the details, then you're going to end up with the kind of doubts that appear in the Matrix second and third movies. But this is not the way we expected it to happen. Well, guess what? It could very well end up happening in a way that is not what you expected. I want to conclude with the story, then I'll end the recording and take a look at the chats. A story from one of the main students of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer, also known as Rabbi Itzla Petterberger. That's the same person. So he had he met with some people, and somebody rich came over to him and asked, "Do you believe that Mashiach can come tomorrow?" Of course. If so, the rich guy answered, well, then your belief contradicts the statement in the Gemara that Mashiach will not come until there is not a penny left in anyone's pocket. Well, each of the wealthy men in this room has interests spread all over the world. It's impossible that each of us should lose every penny by tomorrow. So what do you say to that, Rabbi? I don't know. I would have answered something like, hey, you know what? Well, let's see what happens the next time there's a global depression. You know, see, you're so convinced that people can't lose their money overnight. But Rabbi Petterberger was a lot nicer than that. So he said, I believe with complete faith Mashiach may come tomorrow. Hashem told Avram, your descendants will be tortured and enslaved for 400 years. And yet, we all know the Medrash that the Jews were in Egypt for only 210 years. How can that be? So Chazal have given many answers, and he's not giving any of these answers. But similarly, Mashiach can come at any time. And what about the words of Chazal and this Gemara and that Medrash to the contrary? Let the Darshanim worry about that. Meaning, but Hashem will send Mashiach at the right time. And after it happens, then we'll open up the books and try to figure out how to reinterpret. Oh, it's not 400, it's right 210. Oh, so this must mean that. Don't minimize your faith in Mashiach and Geulah just because there's a statement with the details. The details are not important. They're just speculation. The main thing is that there is going to be Geulah. And so, too, at the end of the Matrix Revolutions, Geulah happens in a way that nobody, through any of the three movies until more or less right before the end, in a way that nobody could have predicted. That doesn't mean it makes a lot of sense. That, just to repeat what I said before, I did not understand the ending and a lot more of the movie until I watched the Philosopher's Commentary with Cornel West and Ken Wilber. But this is something this is one more, for me anyway, this last point, don't worry about the details. It seems to me that there's a parallel between the ideas formulated in source number 21 by the Rambam and as explained in source number 18, Dr. Jaworski about the Matrix movies. Anyway, sorry for going over time. I'm going to end the recording now and take questions. Thank you for joining me. And next week we'll talk about Harry Potter.